The automatic doors of the supermarket slid open, and a woman strode in with sharp, deliberate steps. Her high heels struck the polished tiles with a rhythmic clack, a sound that seemed to announce her presence before she even spoke. Her eyes swept across the checkout lanes, scanning the long lines of customers waiting to pay. The irritation on her face was unmistakable, lips pressed into a thin line, brows slightly furrowed, her entire posture radiating impatience. She let out a loud, exasperated sigh, tilting her head slightly as if to emphasize her frustration. Then, just loud enough for those around her to hear, she muttered under her breath, "It's always the same. No place ever knows how to provide decent service." With that, she tightened her grip on the shopping cart handle and pushed forward, maneuvering through the aisles without so much as a glance at anyone around her. But what she didn't know, what she couldn't have possibly anticipated, was that in just a few minutes, she would no longer be just another impatient customer in a grocery store. No, today, she would become the center of an event that would shake this supermarket and the world beyond it to its core. Because today was not just another ordinary day. Today, she was about to learn a lesson that would stay with her for the rest of her life. Jake stepped through the automatic doors of the supermarket, his eyes gleaming with excitement. Today was his first official day at work. His uniform, crisp and freshly pressed, fit snugly on his slightly small frame. But what mattered most wasn't the uniform. It was the small name tag pinned proudly to his chest, bold letters spelling out, "Jake, Customer Service Assistant." To most people, a part-time job at a supermarket might not seem like anything remarkable, but for Jake, this was a milestone. It was more than just a job. It was proof that he was capable, that he could contribute, that he belonged. He had spent months preparing for this moment, practicing simple tasks like organizing shelves, carefully packing groceries, learning how to interact with customers. Every single effort, every hour of practice had led him to this opportunity. But his excitement was short-lived. The moment he stepped into the employee area, he could feel it. The silent judgment. Some of his new colleagues gave him polite smiles, brief and distant. Others, however, exchanged quick glances, their expressions betraying skepticism. In a small group near the checkout counters, a few employees whispered among themselves, their voices low but just loud enough for Jake to hear. "You think he can handle this job? Probably just some diversity hire. The company wants to look inclusive, that's all." Jake didn't turn around. He pretended he didn't hear. But inside, something stung. He took a deep breath, whispering to himself, "It's okay, just focus on doing your job well." But the real challenge was yet to come. He started with basic tasks, restocking cereal boxes on the shelves, making sure everything was neat and in place. Then he moved to the checkout area, where his main role was assisting customers by bagging their groceries. At first, things went smoothly. A few elderly customers smiled at him warmly as he carefully placed their items into their bags. A middle-aged woman even gave him an encouraging nod and spoke softly. "You're doing great, young man." Jake felt a wave of motivation rush through him. He could do this. He would do this. But then, the supermarket doors slid open once more. The distinct sound of heels clicking against the tiled floor echoed through the store. Megan had arrived. From the moment she stepped in, she stood out, not just in appearance, but in presence. Every movement she made was precise and commanding, exuding an air of absolute confidence. Yet, behind that confidence was something else. A sense of superiority, a quiet disdain for anything that did not meet her standards. She barely glanced at anyone as she strode through the aisles, eyes fixed on the screen of her phone. Occasionally she let out an audible sigh, as if just being in this place was an inconvenience. If a customer in front of her moved too slowly, she didn't hesitate to push past them, sometimes clicking her tongue in frustration. "Another wasted day at this place," she muttered, loud enough for those nearby to hear. She could have been anyone, a successful businesswoman, a person used to getting things done efficiently. But one thing was certain, she was not someone who tolerated delays, inefficiency, or imperfection. Her cart, already half full, had been filled with no regard for price or selection, only speed. Then, as she turned toward the checkout lanes, she saw it. A long line of customers, slowly making their way through. And at the very end of one of those lines, stationed at a register, was Jake. Her eyes narrowed slightly, her lips pressed into a thin line. The mild irritation in her gaze began to shift into something closer to anger. "What the hell is this?" Without waiting another second, Megan pushed her cart forward, marching straight toward the checkout counter, where Jake was working. She had no idea that, in just a few minutes, something was about to happen that would force her to see the world differently. She was about to learn a lesson, one that she would never, ever forget. Jake tightened his grip on the shopping bag, his fingers trembling slightly as he fought to steady himself. He knew he wasn't the fastest worker here. He knew that some of the other employees could bag groceries quicker, move with more efficiency. But he also knew something else. He was careful. He was diligent. And above all, he cared. Every item he picked up, he placed in the bag meticulously, making sure nothing was crushed or misplaced. This was how he worked. But to Megan, none of that mattered. All she saw was a slow, frustrating waste of her time. She crossed her arms, shifting her weight impatiently, then let out an exaggerated sigh as if she could barely stand another second of this. "Oh my God, I cannot believe I have to deal with this. Do you have any idea how much of my time you're wasting?" Jake froze for a split second. He heard every word. He heard the disdain in her voice. He felt the sharp edge of her words cutting into his confidence, slicing through his efforts like they were nothing. But he didn't stop. He forced himself to keep going, focusing on his task. Megan wasn't done. With a sudden, jerky motion, she snatched a bag off the counter and flung it into her cart. The force was too much. The bag tore open on one side, and groceries spilled onto the floor. A carton of eggs rolled out, stopping just inches away from Jake's feet. "See? I can do it faster myself? Do you seriously think you're suited for this job?" Jake instinctively bent down to pick up the fallen items. His hands were shaking now. But Megan wasn't finished. She took a step closer, her voice dropping slightly but still loud enough for everyone around. "Who even hired you? Did they think they were doing you a favor? Is this just some kind of charity case?" Her words struck him like a knife to the chest. The store fell into an eerie silence. The sting of her words, the humiliation wrapping around him, wasn't new. It was familiar, too familiar. In his mind, he was no longer standing at the checkout counter of a supermarket. He was 10 years old again, sitting at a kitchen table, staring at the wood grain, trying to tune out the angry voice above him. "You'll never be good at anything. You're just a burden." His stepfather's voice echoed in his ears, merging with Megan's sharp, condescending tone. His breathing became uneven. His chest tightened. Somewhere in the distance, he could hear the faint shuffle of movement, people shifting uncomfortably, sensing the tension in the air. A few customers had pulled out their phones, recording the interaction. But no one spoke up. The other employees, his co-workers, the people he had spent all day trying to prove himself to, stood at a distance, exchanging uncertain glances. They were hesitating. They were weighing the risks. They were choosing to do nothing. No one acted. Jake swallowed hard, trying to hold himself together. But Megan wasn't finished yet. She leaned in closer, her voice dripping with mockery. "Aren't you embarrassed? Look at yourself, holding up an entire line. If I were you, I'd just quit already." Something inside Jake cracked. His vision blurred slightly, but he refused to let the tears fall. He wouldn't give her that satisfaction. But deep down he was asking himself, why did it have to be this way? Why did he always have to prove himself, again and again? Why did people like Megan get to decide who was good enough and who wasn't? The other customers remained silent. Some of them looked uncomfortable. A few shifted in place, looking away, pretending not to see what was happening. And then a voice rang out. Strong, calm, unshaken. "I think that's enough." Megan froze in place. The confidence she carried just moments ago seemed to waver, if only for a split second. Slowly, she turned her head toward the source of the voice that had just shattered the thick tension in the room. The store, which had been buzzing with murmurs and the quiet rustling of grocery bags, fell into complete silence. Every pair of eyes in the checkout area was now locked on the same figure. At the far end of the counter, a man stepped forward. The bright fluorescent lights overhead reflected off the smooth leather of his jacket. His posture was composed, unwavering. His expression? Calm, yet piercing, as if he had already understood everything before he even took his first step. Will Smith. The moment his name registered in their minds, a ripple of shock coursed through the store. Some customers gasped audibly. Others stood still, eyes wide with disbelief. A few exchanged hushed whispers, their voices barely above a breath. But the real reason for their reaction wasn't just his fame. It was the way he stood there, unshaken, unreadable, radiating an unspoken authority that made it impossible to look away. His presence alone shifted the entire atmosphere of the room. Megan, however, didn't move. She blinked, stepping back ever so slightly, but quickly forced herself to hold her ground. Her pride wouldn't allow her to retreat. Will took another step forward, his voice steady, yet carrying a weight that filled the entire space. "Do you really think you have the right to belittle him?" Megan inhaled sharply, trying to regain control of the situation. She straightened her shoulders, lifting her chin ever so slightly. "I don't have time for this," she scoffed, rolling her eyes, feigning indifference. "I'm just stating the obvious. He's too slow for this job, and I don't intend to waste my time waiting around." Will's gaze locked onto hers. His next words were calm, but they struck like a hammer hitting cold steel. "You think he's wasting your time?" He raised an eyebrow. "Then tell me, how many years have you wasted becoming a person with no compassion?" The store went dead silent. A cashier at the adjacent register stopped mid-scan, mouth slightly open in shock. A few customers in line exchanged knowing glances, smirks twitching at the corners of their lips. Megan stiffened. No one, absolutely no one, had ever spoken to her like that before. She parted her lips, but no words came out. Will's expression didn't change. His voice dropped slightly, but his words became even sharper. "You can have all the money, all the power, but if you can't even show basic human decency to someone who's just trying to do his job, then what exactly do you have?" The energy in the room shifted. For the first time since she walked in, Megan sensed something was very, very wrong. She wasn't the one in control anymore. And worse, she was starting to realize that she was completely alone. The focus of the room had shifted away from Jake. The judgmental stares, the scrutinizing eyes, they were now directed at her. The situation had flipped. She was no longer the dominant figure in the room. She was the outcast. From the back of the line, a middle-aged man spoke up, his voice loud and unwavering. "That's right. Everyone deserves respect." Another voice, this time from a woman standing closer to Megan, chimed in. "If you don't like waiting, maybe try another store. We don't welcome people like you here." Megan's heart pounded. She turned her head, scanning the crowd, expecting to find even a single person who might be on her side. But there was no one. The very people she thought would silently agree with her were now looking at her with nothing but disapproval. Her breath hitched slightly. And then she noticed the phones. People were still recording. Some had been recording from the very beginning. A cold realization swept through her like a tidal wave. This was already bigger than just this moment. This was something that was going to follow her beyond these walls. The internet wouldn't forget. Megan's hands clenched around the handle of her shopping cart. She could feel the weight of every gaze in the room pressing down on her, each pair of eyes like a mirror reflecting back the image of someone she didn't want to see. A woman who had just been publicly humiliated by her own arrogance. Her face turned an angry shade of red. Her pride was screaming at her to fight back. But deep down, she knew she had lost. And then, a single pair of hands clapped. The sound echoed in the quiet room. A middle-aged woman standing near the counter was the first to applaud. A second later, another person joined in, and then another, and another. Within moments, a wave of applause filled the supermarket. It wasn't just for Will Smith. It was for Jake, for all the people who had ever been told they weren't good enough, for every silent bystander who wished they had spoken up before. The clapping grew louder, stronger, a sound of unity, of defiance against cruelty. Megan stood frozen in place, her face burning with humiliation. Then, without a word, she turned sharply on her heels. She stormed toward the exit, gripping her shopping cart so tightly her knuckles turned white. As she approached the automatic doors, they slid open, and just as they slammed shut behind her, the weight of her defeat settled in. She was gone, and with her departure, the air inside the supermarket felt lighter. Will looked deep into Jake's eyes. He didn't just see pain, he saw something burning beneath the surface, a quiet fire, a sense of pride that had never truly been recognized. He placed a firm hand on Jake's shoulder, giving it a reassuring squeeze. "You did great. Don't ever let anyone tell you that you're not good enough." The store erupted in applause. The cashiers, the customers who had remained silent just moments ago, were now clapping. Not just for Jake, but for his resilience, for his quiet strength. Jake didn't speak, but his hands clenched into fists at his sides, his chest rising and falling with heavy breaths. For the first time in his life, he felt something new, recognition. For the first time in his life, he no longer felt invisible. That night, the video capturing Megan's cruel words, Will Smith's unexpected intervention, and Jake's unwavering patience spread across the internet like wildfire. Millions of views, hundreds of thousands of comments. Respect is the bare minimum every human being deserves. Jake, you've inspired millions today. Will's response was legendary. How many years have you wasted becoming someone without compassion? That line hit hard. This isn't just about Jake, this is about every single person who's ever been overlooked or underestimated just because they were different. News stations picked up the story. Major headlines flooded social media. The moment that made the world reflect. Will Smith stands up for a supermarket worker against public humiliation. A small action, a powerful lesson. One sentence can break someone's spirit or change their life forever. But for Jake, none of that mattered, because the real impact wasn't online. It was what happened the next day. When Jake walked into the supermarket the next morning, something felt different. The store was the same, the shelves were the same, but the atmosphere had shifted. The moment he stepped inside, a coworker approached him, smiling, a real, genuine smile. "Good morning, Jake. Feels like a great day, doesn't it?" Jake paused for a moment. For the first time, someone greeted him, not out of politeness, but with real respect. Then something even more unexpected happened. A customer, an older gentleman whom Jake had never met, walked up to him, placed a gentle hand on his shoulder, and looked him straight in the eyes. "You are an inspiration to so many people." Jake didn't know how to respond. All his life, he had been used to pitiful glances, to people looking at him as if he needed help. But today was different. Today he wasn't the one being helped. Today he was the one others looked up to. That evening, when Jake opened his phone, his heart skipped a beat. A notification appeared, a private message from Will Smith. "You did great, Jake. I'm proud of you. If you ever have time, come visit the studio. I'd love to meet you again." Jake read the message once, then twice, then again. He had once believed that he was just an ordinary supermarket employee. But today he knew that he had changed something. Not just for himself, but for millions of people out there. People who had spent their whole lives feeling like they didn't belong. Jake turned his head toward the window. Outside, the night sky was clear, endless, as if it too was welcoming a new beginning. A small smile formed on his lips. For the first time in his life, he truly believed he belonged. Every day, we all have a choice. We can stay silent in the face of injustice, allow it to persist, accept it as just another part of life, or we can stand up, not with anger, not with retaliation, but with strength, with resilience, with the quiet confidence of knowing our worth. Jake chose to stand up. He didn't fight back, he didn't yell, he didn't argue with Megan, he simply continued doing his job with quiet dignity. And that simple act of perseverance was powerful enough to make the world stop and take notice. But this story isn't just about Jake, it's about all of us. About the kids who were bullied just because they were different, about the people who were told they weren't good enough, about everyone who has ever felt overlooked, unworthy, or out of place. And more than that, it's about those who watched it happen but stayed silent. If you had been in that supermarket, what would you have done? Would you have looked away, pretended you didn't see? Or would you have been the first to speak up even if no one else did? The world doesn't change because of those who mock others. The world changes because of those who have the courage to say, "That's enough." You don't need to be the strongest. You don't need to be the richest. You don't need to be a Hollywood star. You just need to have a heart big enough to refuse to be silent in the face of injustice. So, what will you choose? Leave your thoughts in the comments. Have you ever witnessed something like this? If you had been in that supermarket, what would you have done? And don't forget to subscribe for more powerful stories. Thank you for watching, and see you in the next video.